Hey Reddit, what's the strangest coincidence you've ever personally experienced? I used to get 2 buses home from work. I got off the first one having left my phone and keys on the front seat of the bus without realizing. Got on the second bus, went to my favorite front seat and my possessions that I didn't know were missing were waiting for me. The bus had changed driver and route. Still freaks my nut out to this day. Nobody believes me when I tell this story, but one day my husband and I ran into the same couple at 3 different places in 2 different states. So my husband and I had an errand to run out of state. We leave early and stop to get breakfast. The couple was sitting across from us. The lady had on a funky shirt, which is why she stuck out in my mind. After breakfast we drive the next state over to the office we have an appointment at. We're waiting in the lobby and the couple from the breakfast joint walks in. Weird. So we spend the day finishing up our errands and then we drive back home. I didn't feel like cooking, so we stopped to get some dinner at the pub. We sit down at the table and guess who's already eating at the table behind us? The same friggin' couple. I was in St. Augustine on vacation. On the way there I just happened to think about this girl I knew back in college in Orlando. Just sorta wondered what she was up to and the like. Sure as shit I ran into her in a bar there the first night. She was there celebrating graduating from PA school. Me and a friend took some acid one night and were tripping hard. Decided to walk to a gas station and get some smokes or something. We walked by a car lot in the small town I'm from and all of the cars in the lot were cop cars. We were both walking ramrod straight all the way to the store. Very quietly bought whatever we went there for and took a back street back to his place. We just stared at each other for like an hour and didn't speak after we got there. Turns out the city had bought a whole new fleet of cop cars and they had all been delivered there and were on the lot for just that night. Seeing Paul McCartney, the Beatles, on TV in 2001 and noticing he was tall. Next day I'm walking down a very quiet street and walking towards me is a really tall guy and it was Paul McCartney. He must have seen my expression, so he veered my way, stuck his hand out and said hi mate. I was shocked. 18 years later I'm still shocked lol. Edit, I'm 6'1". Turns out he's 5'11". Maybe he was just lanky. He certainly appeared tall to me. I should also add that he didn't just stick his hand out. I meant to say he shook my hand. Crazy. He then briskly walked away. A very brief encounter, but a really important one for me. I also wouldn't blame anyone for not believing me. It's a weird story. Was sitting in a restaurant about 200 miles from where I live telling my mother, who was visiting from a different country, about a trip I had to another country, about 6,000 miles away, with a work colleague, and the lady at the table next to us leans over and says, I think you're talking about my son. Turns out I was sitting next to my colleague's parents while showing my mum pictures of our trip. In grade 10 English class, the teacher didn't have anything planned for us to do, and it was close to the end of the year I guess, so she goes to the big cupo board in the corner and pulls out a stack of copies. It's examples of a successful essay written during a final exam, so we can learn what a good one looks like, and how to build a narrative, etc. The topic of these was what was the most pivotal moment of your life. There's 3 examples, ranging in proficiency. We read through the first 2. And I volunteer to read the last one aloud. I start reading, and I stop. The essay was about me. My big sister had gotten a really good mark 6 years earlier on her final exam essay which she wrote about the day I was born. I got pretty emotional about that one. Worked half day. Drove 6 hours from Southern California to Northern California for car camping with my wife. Chose obscure campground which was neatly deserted, off season. Picked the most deserted and remote campsite location. We planned on rocking the tent. Were bummed after setting camp and another couple selects site right next to us. Turns out to be a coworker I'd spoken with earlier that day. Edit, I hadn't told coworker anything about plans. We weren't close. Earlier that day we spoke briefly of work-related issue. My wife and I were in Tucson visiting my mother who just moved there. My wife decided she wanted a tamale. We drove around for 2 hours stopping in restaurants looking for tamales. Couldn't find one. Went back to my mother's apartment. Literally 2 minutes later somebody knocked on the door of my mother's apartment asking us if anyone wanted to buy any tamales. One year I got a roommate through Craigslist. The guy was weird for sure, but good natured and paid rent. Anyway, after about 2 months of living with him, my cousin comes over to hang. I introduce the two and my cousin in the most chill voice ever said, "Nah man, we know each other." Turns out they were college roommates 5 years earlier in another state. Not me, but a pretty interesting story in my family. Two of my great grandfathers got imprisoned in the same jail and served time together. My great grandfather on my mother's side was an architect and even drew my other great grandfather's house. Did their children know each other at the time, or were they just two dudes in prison? Just two dudes in prison. My parents got together over 30 years after this. I think they found out this when my grandparents met each other. This is also kind of like a dark spot on both families' history and my grandparents don't like to talk about it. My sister, Emily, was on a ski lift in New Mexico when some younger girl across from her asked if her name was Emily. Apparently the stranger, who kind of looked similar but underage, had found her lost ID the year prior and had been using it for a year to buy alcohol. Edit. After this blew up I texted my sister, who reminds me it was weirder. She was later hiking with friends for 17 hours. They got tired, thumbed for a hitchhike, and got picked up by this girl's twin. I moved from my small hometown halfway across the country to a small city where I knew absolutely no one. At the first party I went to in the new town, I started chatting with a guy. Turns out he had also just left my small hometown. I met a Canadian guy while on holiday in South America and we ended up going sightseeing together. At the end of the day a person behind us tapped him on the shoulder and asked if the scar behind his ear was from cancer surgery. They got talking. Turns out they were from the same small town in Canada, had the same type of brain cancer, and had been operated on by the same surgeon. Was at the dentist getting a crown extension. Dentist: "Hey, you were born on July 13th. So was I." Assistant: "Me too." We all shared a look of surprise and longing with each other, longing to be closer. Then they drilled the absolute fuck out of my teeth. Had a kidney transplant last year. Nurse makes a comment about it having my name on it. He elaborated to say that the donor has the same surname as me. An officer from a different PD was showing me a picture of a guy they wanted to arrest in a different part of town. As I looked up from the computer, I see dipshit riding by on a bike, literally 5 feet away from the squad car. Was at a convention. There were only a few people in the room. My friend and I wanted an autograph from a voice actor. He started singing in his character voice. There were two random guys next to me. One pulled out a video camera to record it. Years later, my husband and I are talking with friends, and the convention comes up. The guy with the video camera was my husband. I also took a picture later that day of the crowds, and he is in that picture. I stood next to my husband years before I met him. I have an uncommon last name and a not a common first name. I was in the hospital for a surgery and the person in the next room was there for the same surgery. Come to find out that we were second cousins and never knew that the other existed. He had the same name as me and his wife had the same name as my wife. So fortunate you were there for the same surgery. Can you imagine if you were there for different things and the doctors mixed up who was there for what? I've had several small world experiences, but the biggest was talking to a girl after my first university class and discovering through the course of a 2-hour-long conversation that our grandmothers had been each other's maid of honor and my aunt and her mom were best friends since childhood. Back in the early/mid 90s the phone system changed and you no longer needed to dial the area code for a long distance in-state call. We are a small state with only one area code. One morning I woke up to the phone ringing, and when I picked up I recognized the voice on the other end as belonging to my old boss from a few years ago. She had an unmistakable voice. We had a nice conversation for a bit before she realized she had dialed the wrong number. I lived in a different town in a different part of the state, but the number must have been off by only one digit from the one she tried to call. To add to the coincidence, I had overslept and would have been late for work if she hadn't called me and woken me up. Started dating this girl a few weeks ago. We get to talking about where we live, etc. She lives in not only the same building, but exact same apartment I lived in 2 years ago. It was so fucking bizarre walking into my old apartment that I never thought I would see again. What are the odds? The person who sits next to me at work copies everything I do, except she has no way of knowing. I wear a blue sweater, she wears a blue sweater. I bring leftover spaghetti, she brings leftover spaghetti. It is so weird, I almost hate her. When I was 18, I lived in a town a very long ways away from where I ended up moving. I struck up a friendship with this guy from work in that town. We play Halo, watch movies, ECT, and he was awesome. I ended up moving suddenly due to a family emergency and never got his contact information. I didn't even remember his name a decade later, but I thought of him often as he was an awesome guy through all the years. 11 years later, I'm working at my job, carpooling with someone from my training class, and one night he asks if I mind his roommate being in the car as he was going to take the car after we got off at work and use it for the night. He introduces us, I turn around, and in the backseat is the guy from the town a very long ways away. We reconnected immediately and now live together. He's my best friend, for sure, and the godfather to my children.